Inside the jury room, let's play hardball. Good evening, I'm Chris Matthews in San Francisco. Let me start tonight with this. A juror speaks. Juror number B37 said that there was a difference in the initial vote when they started deliberations last Friday in Sanford, Florida. Not all of the 6 women had the same judgment of what they heard during the many weeks of trial of George Zimmerman. One of the jurors, according to juror B37, wanted to convict the defendant of second-degree murder. 2 of the jurors were ready to convict on manslaughter. So this raises the question, at least to a degree, of whether a stronger prosecution case or a weaker performance by Zimmerman's high-quality defense team would have made the difference late in the day. Well, the questions people are focusing on deal with the ability of this particular jury to understand what it's like to be a black youth in today's America. To use that familiar phrase, do they get it? Do they know what it's like to have people suspect you of the worst because of what you look like, what you're dressed like, or some combination? And are the people making their judgments about this case looking at the narrower question of guilt or innocence that the jury was asked to decide? Not what's happened in this country over the centuries and decades, not what happens every day today on the highways, on the streets, and in the stores of America, where young African Americans get singled out and often humiliated, but what happened in those very few moments or less when the tragedy reached its climax. As I said last night, we need a larger jury to see the larger pictures and to make the larger judgment. Does anyone disagree? Billy Martin's a criminal defense attorney. The Washington Post, Jonathan Capehart, is, of course, an MSNBC contributor. Gentlemen, thank you. I want to hear all your judgments. I have my own. I want to hear yours. This is my listening time. I'm learning a lot about America the last few days. Let's look at this right now. One of the 6 jurors, as I said, spoke out for the first time last night on CNN. She didn't identify herself, but she did speak openly about the case, apparently candidly. Who knows? She said she didn't think race played a role in Zimmerman's thinking that night, in his thinking. Let's listen.
Why do you think George Zimmerman found Trayvon Martin suspicious then?
Because he was cutting through the back. It was raining. He said he was looking in houses as he was walking down the road, kind of just not having a purpose to where he was going. He was stopping and starting. But I mean, that's George's rendition of it.
Was that a common belief on the jury that race did not play a role in this?
I think all of us thought race did not play a role.
Well, she also said she thought Zimmerman was well-intentioned that night. Let's watch.
I think his heart was in the right place. It just went terribly wrong.
Do you think he's guilty of something?
I think he's guilty of not using good judgment. When he was in the car and he called 911, he shouldn't have gotten out of that car.
Do you have any doubt that George Zimmerman feared for his life?
I had no doubt George feared for his life in the situation he was in at the time.
Billy Martin, you're a skilled trial attorney, one of the best. Tell me what you think about that comment. What does that tell you about the case, the way it was fought by the prosecution, the way it was defended by the defense team?
Hey, Chris, what that juror's comments mean to me and what they signify to me is that she did not get it in terms of understanding race relations and race in America. I start at the beginning. You have a young 17-year-old kid who happens to be African-American who's walking through a neighborhood coming from a convenience store, and he's followed. That kid probably had real fear in his life when he tried to lose Mr. Zimmerman, and he could not. He was frightened for his life. And to hear her say that she didn't think that race played a role, as a black man, as a father of a young black kid, I would think that what first came to my mind was, I'm in trouble and I'm running for my life, or I'm trying to lose this kid. And I think that the prosecution did not put on a very good case. And I think that the prosecution allowed the defense to talk about George Zimmerman's story. You hear this juror, and you see the familiarity with George Zimmerman.
She called him George.
She calls him George. She calls him George. And you can see that she bought George's story and George Zimmerman never testified. I think the prosecution made a colossal mistake, a biggest mistake in this trial, when they allowed George Zimmerman's statements to come in their case in chief through the detective and then through his friend. I think it was a big mistake.
I also, the fact, and you have to allow for the fact, there he was sitting several feet from her for all these weeks. Maybe she did develop some identity with this guy. Who knows? But here's my larger, well, it's not a larger question. It's my only question. Do you think there was a way for the prosecution to skillfully and effectively present the experience as they understood it to be of Trayvon Martin in those critical moments? In other words, infused with the knowledge you've just given it in terms of social reality in this country, racial reality, how could they have presented in court a sort of a virtual picture of what this young guy was going through right up until he was shot? How could they do it? Is it impossible?
I don't think it was impossible. I think what the prosecutors had to do here was make it simple. Keep this case very simple. He was following. The evidence would show that George Zimmerman called the police to say that he was following this young man, and the police told him not to. We don't need you to do that. That he was carrying a gun. That at some point that gun came out. If they had kept that simple without putting his statements in, I think the jurors would have been confronted with a different case, and George Zimmerman would have been forced to take the witness stand to tell his story directly and been subject to cross-examination.
Jonathan, let's go to the political part. You and I are more familiar with it. Of course, you're an African American, so you are familiar with this. Have you ever been bothered by police? Have you been bothered by people in a way you could describe that said they're just looking at me as a black guy, no matter what I've done in school, no matter how well I've behaved in my life, they're looking at me in profile terms?
Oh, sure. I mean, I've never had a situation with the police, but I've had the more mundane, in other ways, more corrosive interactions, from not being picked up by cabs in New York City years ago, and there I am standing with an LL Bean tote bag and dressed in a jacket and tie, and cabs wouldn't stop, and I had to come up with my own ways of getting cabs in New York City. And just recently, my mother and I, Mother's Day, we went into a local store right here on 14th Street, and we were greeted at the door by this young person. We said hello, and we kept walking around the store, looking around, and every time we turned around, there was this guy. And my mother felt so uncomfortable. She said, "Let's get out of here." Every time I turn around, he's underfoot. So those are the situations that I have to deal with still to this day.
How does that influence, inform you as to what you saw? I'm not going to put words in your mouth. Did you see something in that trial that these white women, or mostly white women, 5 out of 6 with the Hispanic woman, didn't see in terms of the testimony, the actual hearing of the evidence?
Yeah, well, Chris, there's not enough time in your show to go through all that. But I think there are two reasons why probably race didn't come into the trial as prominently as I think a lot of people thought it would. And it boils down to 2 rulings against the prosecution by Judge Nelson. One, she said that the prosecution could not say in its opening argument that Trayvon Martin was racially profiled. She said that they could say he was profiled and people could make their own inferences from that. The other thing that ruling that she made against the prosecution was saying that all of George Zimmerman's 911 calls could not be played in court, only some of them. If all of them, and I think they numbered more than 25 or 30, if they were all played and the jury could hear over and over and over again George Zimmerman saying that the people he's talking about are black males, African American males, black teenage males, that I think the conversation might have gone a whole lot differently, and most certainly race would have to have come up in that jury room.
Okay, well, let's take a look at what Eric Holder, the Attorney General, had to say. He was addressing the NAACP down in Orlando late this afternoon, where he talked about the Trayvon Martin killing. Let's watch.
I'd like to join President Obama in urging all Americans to recognize that, as he said, we are a nation of laws, and the jury has spoken. I know the NAACP and its members are deeply and rightly concerned about this case, as passionate civil rights leaders, as engaged citizens, and most of all, as parents. This afternoon, I want to assure you of 2 things. I am concerned about this case, and as we confirmed last spring, the Justice Department has an open investigation into it. Now, While that inquiry is ongoing, I can promise that the Department of Justice will consider all available information before determining what action to take.
Attorney General Holder also spoke about the Trayvon Martin case in personal terms, as you just see. Let's listen to more.
For all the progress that we've seen, recent events demonstrate that we still have much more work to do and much further to go. The news of Trayvon Martin's death last year and the discussions that have taken place since then reminded me of my father's words so many years ago. And they brought me back to a number of experiences that I had as a young man, when I was pulled over twice and my car searched on the New Jersey Turnpike when I'm sure I wasn't speeding, or when I was stopped by a police officer while simply running to catch a movie at night in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. I was, at the time of that last incident, a federal prosecutor.
Well, the Attorney General also said that Trayvon's death caused him to sit down with his own son to talk about the issues of being a black man in America. Pretty strong stuff. Let me go back to Billy Martin in this. And your sense, let's get to the question of the Attorney General here. He's definitely in the determining seat here, not just the hot seat. He has to make a judgment call whether there is a good case to be made about a civil rights violation here. What do you see?
Chris, I had the pleasure of serving as a federal prosecutor with the Attorney General. I know the Attorney General. I know that he will look at this, he and his staff will look at this to see if Zimmerman's prior statements, his prior positions brought race into it, and they can show that he was, in fact, violating Trayvon Martin's civil rights. He'll look at it. It did not come in his trial because of some of the rulings of the court, but the totality of the circumstances will let him decide if George Zimmerman actually profiled and stalked Trayvon Martin, and that leads to civil rights violation. It should be investigated.
Let me get down to the narrow point here, and I don't want to say something that offends anybody, but I'm trying to find out the law here. If it says in the tapes that you have evidence of now with the dispatcher, where does he ever say that there were African-American kids before, young adults, who had been involved with burglaries? Did he have an identification of previous people who had been involved or suspected of committing these crimes in the neighborhood as African-Americans? Does that constitute profiling for him to look for people who meet that description? Billy?
I'm not sure. Chris, Jonathan may be a better source for that. I don't know. I don't know the previous 911 calls.
Okay, Jonathan, do you have any knowledge? I'm just asking the political question, or rather the logic question. If you're looking for particular suspects, like two Irish guys are involved in some IRA incident, you're not looking for people generally guilty because you think there's an ethnic profile that's relevant, but you know you're looking for a particular description. Is that profiling? I wouldn't think so, if that's the case.
Well, in George Zimmerman's calls, he does identify the people he's alerting the police to or complaining about to the police. My question is, do all of those calls rise to meet a legal standard for the Justice Department, or at least as part of a legal standard the Justice Department can use to prosecute George Zimmerman? That is what I'm not clear on.
Well, I trust the Attorney General. I hope he makes the right call, and I hope it ends up being the right one in terms of how the case turns out. I think to bring the case and fail wouldn't accomplish anything. But anyway, Billy Martin, sir, it's great to have you on. And Jonathan, as always, thanks for that personal account, though. I mean, people like me need to hear that stuff. I've been hearing them the last few days, and I'm kind of amazed because people have never come, and friends of mine haven't told me this has been happening to them right through their adult successes. You know, it doesn't seem to help to succeed. Sorry for us. Sorry for you too, Jonathan. Anyway, witness for the prosecution. When Rachel Gentile testified, many thought she damaged the prosecution's case. Many did, but last night we got another side of her altogether. So why didn't the prosecutions do a better job of preparing this young woman for her day in court? Also, some of the mud atop Virginia's Governor Bob O'Donnell's